Good afternoon, happy Thursday, and welcome back. I'm so excited that I get to say those words, welcome back, because that means that X-Bulletin has successfully made it over the hump to the second episode. Now, I realize over the hump technically means that you made it to 3 episodes. Most startup podcasts that people try to do usually get 1 or 2 under their belt, and then they falter at the 3rd episode. So we're not counting our chickens before they hatch here just yet, but I do think this is a very good sign that we successfully have made it to the second episode of the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers Community Forums, powered by your stories. I am Brownygate, Bill720 on the forums, plain old regular forum moderator, ready to deliver you. I mean, we are stacked and packed, locked and loaded, as Brian used to say. Another solid 5 segments of content are headed your way here tonight. But first, our opening monologue. Very exciting announcements here to get things started out with. To begin, X-Bulletin is now on Spotify. You know you've made it as a podcast when it's available on Spotify, even if not a whole lot of people are listening to it there yet. And the reason why that's significant is the subject of the second part of tonight's opening monologue, and that is that X-Bulletin is already blocked in the country of Russia. And it's not because of anything controversial that I said, although, as you know, I do not shy away from controversial statements. It's actually due to Content ID. Now, if you listen to my opening monologue last week, you might be thinking, aha, I told you so, Content ID would be your downfall for using all of that commercial music in the show. And as you know, I do not make any apologies for including all that wonderful bumper music. It really livens up the show and makes it less boring and more natural to listen to. However, this is something I would like to take a moment and go on a quick rant about, because I feel like there's just so much misinformation floating around about Content ID, what it is, what it does, and how it works, that I really need to set the record straight. Because that's what we're all about here on X-Bulletin, is basically me setting the record straight. It's also about telling my stories and your stories, which you can feel free to email in to xdapodcast@outlook.com with the word podcast somewhere in the subject line of your email message, or just leave it in the comments section on YouTube or in an appropriate thread on the XDA Developers Forums. But setting the record straight here, Content ID. If you watch any number of popular or even slightly popular YouTube channels, invariably somebody will whine and complain about Content ID, and rightfully so. It is a very sensitive system. Content ID has been in place for well over 10 years at this point, as of the creation, as of the recording of this very episode. And it basically does what it says on the box. It matches up content, it identifies it, it matches up music, movie clips, television show segments and pieces that are included in people's YouTube videos. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that if there's a Content ID match, in 98% of cases or more, nothing happens. It recognizes it flags it on the list. It is not a copyright strike, and it doesn't lead to a blocking of the video. In fact, YouTube successfully identified every single piece of music, I believe with absolutely no exceptions, from last week's episode. However, there was one particular track, that being Cobra Style by Teddy Bears. For whatever reason, it did match and did lead to the video being blocked in Russia. Now, in my experience, I've used commercial music in many YouTube videos over a decade at this point. So I'm no stranger to getting the automated email from the system telling me that there was a Content ID match, but I can tell you for sure that it almost always never leads to copyright strike or to blocking of the video. It may prevent you from monetizing it, which I realize people whine and complain about, but that's actually a blessing in disguise, because that means you don't have to be beholden to YouTube, and you don't have to tiptoe over every little piece of content that might even be falsely identified in the video. This gives me full and total creative control over the process here, which is something that I actually like having. But with that said, if you are in Russia and you do want to hear that first episode, and even if you're not and you just want to listen to the audio of it, I do have these episodes structured such that you won't ever miss anything significant by not watching the video version of it. So to that end, both episodes, by the time this airs on YouTube, should be available also on Spotify. and thus concludes the opening monologue. But don't go anywhere, there's still so much more to come, including our mid-evening rant, the ever-popular mobility stories, and that unpopular opinion of the week that I like so much. But first, X-Bulletin Investigates, the hard-hitting journalism that you deserve, is coming up next. Don't go anywhere.
Hey, what's going on here?
Never mind that, Crump.
Hey, don't touch that! Whoa! I told you. Hops, you got a problem here. Christ, open up that goddamn thing. Find the rope, Rusty. It's time. Get me to swing that thing side to side.
The G5 rose out of the ashes of Apple design failure like the iBook G3 and the PowerMac G4, which themselves were believed to have been inspired by the 8th generation Buick Riviera.
Oh, no, you've got to go downtown, George. It's all downtown. Just like the song says.
The song?
There's your answer. Downtown.
I don't know why, I just find it highly amusing to watch an all-in-one computer running without a screen. Good afternoon and welcome back. It's time for an X-Bulletin Investigates segment, getting, as Ben Shapiro used to say, the hot, sticky journalism everywhere. I'd like to open this show up by saying last week, which was a tremendous episode, it was a barn burner of a show, and I strongly recommend you listen to it. In our second segment, we did have special guest Tima on for our moderation highlights. And it was a great segment, a great episode. I wasn't able to include absolutely every single thing that was said just because I didn't want the episode dragging on for longer than an hour, which we still managed to do. There was still so much content in there, but there was something mentioned that really got me thinking. I asked Tima what his everyday carry was, what his mobile device of choice is at this time, and somewhat surprisingly, he informed me that it was the OnePlus 6T. OnePlus, for those of you who don't know, is kind of an enthusiast brand. Think of it as like the ThinkPad of mobile devices. It's meant to be a higher class, streamlined device that's budget friendly, but still strong on specifications and streamlined in terms of software. And you could make the case that they've strayed from that mission over the course of the past several years, but they've still continued to pump out devices consistently year after year. The 6T was their late 2018 offering, and that got me thinking, if he's using a device that's almost 5 years old at this point, how old is too old when it comes to retaining old mobile devices? Now, as I mentioned last week, the answer to that question varies depending on what time period you're in. If we're talking about like the late 1990s or the 2000s, 2 or 3 years was the max. Device would be very much obsolete just because technology moved so quickly during that time. And again, we're going to go over this in great detail later in the show. Mobility in the 1990s and 2000s was practically a religion. You had to be committed to it because it would be a very costly endeavor. The devices just weren't all that good, and they would be obsolete, both the hardware and the software, rapidly just because of how quickly it all moved. Now today, that's very different. In fact, we've jumped the river from actual obsolescence into forced obsolescence, which got me thinking, how old is too old when it comes to retaining a mobile device as your primary, as your secondary, or even just to use it at all? And so that is going to be the subject of tonight's X-Bulletin Investigate segment. There are 4 angles to take on this, and I'm going to go over all of them in detail here. The first one is the security angle. The second one, as I alluded to earlier, is the forced obsolescence angle. The third is the hardware degradation angle, and then finally, actual obsolescence. Let's go over those in order here. Security angle. Now, I actually had a long and interesting conversation, not on XDA, but on Reddit of all places. And this was a fiercely interesting debate that I actually quite enjoyed having. Some people dread getting in these long-form discussions online, but if people are mature enough to be able to have a discussion, then it can actually be worthwhile. And in this case, I think it was. This person had posted in a thread on Reddit about a person who was using a Galaxy S3 as his daily driver. Now, the S3, I didn't actually look this up beforehand, because we do such great show prep here. That would have been released, I believe, in 2011, maybe 2012. So it's an older device. It wouldn't have received operating system upgrades in quite a few years. And somebody, when you have this conversation, will inevitably bring up the topic of security. It's like, oh, it's not getting security patches anymore. What are we going to do? And in practice, I pointed out that this just really isn't a concern. I mean, it is to some extent. There are security flaws and security holes that will inevitably be brought up. I would never, in a professional setting, recommend to a paying customer, you should use a Galaxy S3 as your daily driver. I think this person who I was having the discussion with fundamentally misunderstood what my point was there, and it wasn't that, to be perfectly clear. But on the other hand, you shouldn't necessarily use that as an excuse to give up the device. I mean, if people are jonesing for an excuse all the time to be able to justify spending of $1,000+ on a cell phone, and if that's the angle they want to take, they can. But in practice, it doesn't usually matter. There are some things that happen from time to time. There may be zero-click vulnerabilities, like there was one that was pointed out related to the image decoder as it relates to MMS messages. There was the Bluetooth vulnerability and the WPA vulnerability. And a lot of times those more serious items will get patched out of band, even after the OEM is not pushing out software updates on a regular basis for the device anymore. Even Motorola, when they were just in the throngs of not updating their devices, the Moto X Pure Edition still got the patch for the WPA vulnerability and the Bluetooth thing. So those things get more patched than people realize, even when the device is out of support. But in practice, if it was a huge problem, if there was just epic spreads of malware or targeted attacks, you would hear about it. That's not the sort of things people would keep quiet about on the forums, on XDA, Reddit, or anywhere else. If there was a serious enough thing, one of the annoying journalists somewhere, or even users on the forums, would mention it. So that's all I have to say about the security angle. Second is the forced obsolescence angle. Now, some people will tell you, especially on the iPhone side, that software updates to the device itself are put out in such a way where the software is heavier and the operating system itself is more difficult for the device to run. And that may be true to some extent, but I really don't think that it's actually true in the way that people think that it is. And let me explain what I mean by that. Yes, the operating system, as it gets more modules and more features, is going to get a little bit heavier. But in practice, it's actually the software itself that runs on there that gets heavier, not the operating system. If you just do a clean install of a stock ROM or a custom ROM on an older device, when you're just thumbing around the operating system, pulling up the app list, opening up settings and looking at stuff, it's actually going to feel pretty quick and snappy like it did, for the most part. But it's when you start installing packages on top of that, the heavier, newer software, I think, is really what's to blame for that. The third side of this coin is the hardware degradation angle. And there's really two ways I think this manifests more commonly, and that is the only things on the device that actually wear out physically. That is the battery and the storage. And the battery issue is really more of a problem on devices that have non-user replaceable batteries than anything else. But in those cases, people are going to be far less apt to have the device repaired or venture into trying to do it themselves. Even on a device like the Moto X Pure Edition, which has a sealed-in battery, but it's relatively replaceable. I have to wonder, exactly how many people actually opted to replace the batteries on those devices. At this point, I've had the battery on mine replaced at least 2 or 3 times now, although only one of those was with a legit battery, and the legit one still only lasted 2 or 3 years, and at this point, the device will shut down within a matter of minutes of it being unplugged to actually use it. Now, I do record audio on it. Like I said, it's the best microphone that I have, so I still nurse it along in that case, but I know that that battery inside of there is hopelessly swollen up and basically a glorified small capacitor at this point. The other thing that I saw mentioned online, and I don't know how true this is, and I really don't even have a way of benchmarking it terribly effectively, is degradation of the storage. Flash memory, flash storage only lasts so long. There are not an unlimited number of read-write cycles, and part of this might actually dovetail into forced obsolescence because you had devices that were released with multiple different sizes of storage. The Moto X Pure Edition, for example, was a 16, 32, or 64 gigabyte of storage device plus the SD card slot. The one that I wound up with was the base model with 16 gigabytes of storage. And if you got that one, even back in the day, an SD card was mandatory to be able to make use of the device, especially with the giant pictures that the 20 megapixel camera would take. But even ignoring that, installing a few applications, updating a few of the system apps, that would fill up that storage rapidly. So as a result, a lot more of the storage was used more often. And flash storage has a finite lifespan and a limited number of read-write cycles. And somebody at some point studied this, but the software that was used for it was never really published. So we never really had a way to be able to verify that. But after a certain number of cycles, the performance of the storage is reduced tremendously. That might be another thing that contributes. And again, I don't have any way to verify this personally, and I don't even like dispensing, personal speculation without any hard scientific proof, but I have a strong suspicion that this is actually a pretty significant piece of the puzzle. The final piece, of course, is actual obsolescence. After a certain point, the level of quality of software and the level of capability that we demand of it simply outpaces the hardware that we have. Now, this is actually a diminishing factor because after a while, there's only so many fancy animations, there's only so many pixels that you can fit on the screen before the human eye can't even make it out anymore. After you can't go much higher in terms of resolution on a 5.5 or 6-inch device than 2560 by 1440, or more accurately, if you're describing it in portrait orientation, 1440 by 2560, before you just don't see anything of it anymore. I think Sony had a couple devices that had 4K screens, but it was just ridiculous and overkill. Even Samsung on their stock ROMs, out of the box, the interface and everything that you see is rendered at something less than the native resolution, and then it's just stretched out to fit the screen. Now, I can see the difference. I still have somewhat okay eyesight at this point in my life, so I turn all that off. I want to see the actual resolution of the screen that I paid for. But after a certain point, there's no reason for having a higher resolution screen. And so as a result, there's nowhere else to go from here. With the exception of if you have like an OLED screen going from pen tile to actual RGB proper subpixels, that looks a little bit better, but that's no more toll on the graphics processing hardware. It's still having to render the same size of canvas. So after a certain point, actual obsolescence slows. It never stops, but it slows, and it's just not as big of a factor. It's a smaller part of that puzzle. Those 4 pieces are not equal size slices of the pie or of the pizza, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, with that said, how old is too old? Well, realistically speaking, you have to look at the minimum target or the minimum system requirement version of Android for any given application. And the hardware specs matter to some extent too. In my experience, I would say when it comes to flagship level devices, somewhere between 5 and 7 years. For mid-rangers, it's probably more like 4 to 6, and then for low-end devices, 3 to 5 years. That's the short answer to how old is too old to use a device as your daily driver. And the same works with iOS. People think, oh, well, Apple, they push out all these software updates for these older devices. And yes, that is true. But most importantly, the software development tools that they provide for their developers to be able to publish applications on the App Store target only the newest 1, 2, or maybe 3 versions of the operating system. And so once you get past that point, it's almost impossible to acquire software for the devices anymore. So they put on that show like, oh, well, we got the newest version of iOS on a device that's 5 years old. But after that, you are pretty much out in the cold within a few years. So the practical difference between Android and iOS, even though a high-end Android device might only get the operating system updates for 3 years versus 5 for the iPhone, it's a moot point because the oldest device you can use is still the same age no matter what platform you're dealing with. So while that may not answer all the questions, those I think are at least some useful thoughts that you can chew on as an audience that I believe are worthy of consideration here on your source for the hard-hitting journalism, that being X-Bulletin, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers Forums, powered by your stories. Don't go anywhere. We still have a lot in store for you, including mobility stories, the ever-popular, unpopular opinion of the week, but first, our mid-evening rant, coming up next. Calling all would-be advertisers. How would you like to shill on X-Bulletin? Well, now you can. Email xdapodcast@outlook.com with the word podcast somewhere in the subject line of your email message to let me know that you're interested, and we'll see what we can work out. X-Bulletin continues next. Good afternoon, happy Thursday, and welcome back to the show, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers Forums, powered by your stories and by me. Tonight on the mid-evening rant, I would like to get right into the topic here, and we're going to discuss mouse acceleration in non-Windows operating systems. The functional purpose of the mid-evening rant is for me to just shine a burning spotlight on a topic that doesn't receive the level of care and attention that it deserves. Last week, it was camera quality in mainstream smartphone reviews, and we just busted myths and shattered through whatever crap needed to be shattered through in order to get the message out there that mainstream reviews gloss over not just the quality of the camera, but the camera software, the microphones, lack of stereo. But I digress. This week we're talking about mouse acceleration. Now, mouse acceleration doesn't necessarily apply to mobile devices as we think of them, pocket-sized computers, because there is no mouse acceleration for a touchscreen input, at least when it's a one-to-one level of input where you point your finger and touch on the screen is where the pointer goes as soon as you poke the screen. Any other form of scaled input, such as a trackpad or a conventional mouse, a trackball, a pointing stick, where the operating system and the driver are scaling your movement to the mouse pointer itself, those are situations where mouse acceleration applies. And to provide you with just the simplest example of this, if you're not familiar, take a standard plain old regular computer mouse. It could be a fancy one or just a regular one. If you move it 1 inch on the surface, the mouse pointer on the screen is going to move a certain distance. Now, if you perform that same stroke again, you move the mouse 1 inch from where it was in any direction, and you move it quickly this time, you're going to find that the pointer moves farther. Even though the amount of distance covered on the tracking surface was identical, you have told the operating system by moving the mouse more quickly that you want to move farther. And you might not even realize this. I might be blowing your mind right now if this is something that you've never thought of or never really looked at before, but try it. It doesn't matter if you're using a trackpad, a pointing stick, trackball, plain old regular mouse, any situation where it's a scaled input, mouse acceleration in Windows applies. And other operating systems have mouse acceleration as well, but I need to give you the baseline here first, that being the way that Windows does it, because when Windows does mouse acceleration, it is based on science. The Windows method of mouse acceleration is the best. It is the industry standard. It has been for decades at this point, going back to the 1990s. This is why people who use Windows and have used Windows their entire lives can track more accurately and more quickly than anybody else on the planet. If you were born and raised with Windows and with mouse acceleration on, it doesn't even matter if you're using a trackpad on a laptop. It could even be a small and not very good trackpad. You're still going to be tracking fairly accurately as long as you have the sensitivity set right and the settings dialed in. You're going to be in pretty good shape overall. Now, with that said, there are certain things that can hold the process back. Some trackpads just suck, like the one on the ThinkPad X230. That comes to mind as just being a not very detailed trackpad. The original Surface Pro, if you can believe it, actually had a pretty small, terrible trackpad. Surface Pro 2. Starting with the Surface Pro 3, they switched over to a far more accurate and also importantly a larger trackpad. So those ones were a lot better. Not only was the hardware improved and the size of the pad improved, but so was the software for it. So there's definitely a case to be made for the hardware, but software is an important part of this. You might have seen mice that try too hard, and the drivers that try too hard to do fancy stuff to it actually cut back on this, because the Windows mouse acceleration algorithm is so linear and so good. Once you've had experience with it, you can never go back to not having mouse acceleration, or worse, having a different operating system's mouse acceleration. Linux distributions can vary quite significantly with this. Most of them either have no mouse acceleration or they have kind of a hit and miss level of mouse acceleration. But it's Mac OS X that is absolutely horrible in this regard. If you've gone, and I learned this is not something that I've just intrinsically known my whole life. When I was in high school, I had a Power Mac G5. And in fact, there's videos of this on YouTube that you can watch. And I used that alongside an old Pentium 4 computer. I used it with the same keyboard and the same mouse because the Power Mac G5 didn't accept PS2 peripherals. And this was the only non-PS2 mouse and keyboard set that I owned, so I had to switch it between the two machines. But for whatever reason, and it took me the longest time to figure this out, when I would switch between the two machines, for whatever reason, even though I had the mouse sensitivity set pretty similarly in both operating systems, my efficiency and accuracy was just somehow worse in Mac OS X, and I couldn't figure out why. I researched this, I downloaded software, and at the end of the day, I'll just cut to the chase here, there was no victory for it. Mac OS X has mouse acceleration turned on by default, but Mac OS X's mouse acceleration is so bad. It is completely counterintuitive, especially to a Windows user. It's no wonder why that operating system has so many keyboard shortcuts in it. It's just that the mouse acceleration is completely and utterly awful to the point where it's realistically broken. I mean, it's a step above broken in that it technically works. You can point around and use it in the operating system, but people go to great lengths to use gestures and external shortcut input devices, thousands of keyboard shortcuts and stuff. And the reason why is because Mac OS X's mouse acceleration is so insufferably bad. It was designed by what I can only describe as the rotted brain of Steve Jobs. I don't know where this came from or who came up with it. It's been a thing for years and years at this point, and it's absolutely terrible. Everything else is kind of a Wild West. Samsung, with how they implemented an Android, I really can't tell what it is. I haven't been able to hook it up to an external monitor to really be able to test it in depth. What I can tell you is that if you're curious about this, if you don't believe me, if you want to test it for yourself, I'll go to classic.mouseaccuracy.com and just run the test with the default parameters on whatever kind of monitor you have in whatever browser you use. It doesn't matter what mouse you're using, 17 is the sweet spot. I can hit that with pretty much any basic mouse, and even with my Dell Precision M6400's built-in trackpad. That's just a really good trackpad, and it's proof that you don't have to have a fancy mouse driver or a giant trackpad to be able to get really good accuracy on a computer for pointing. Even newer machines like the ThinkPads that I've owned, even with the Windows Precision driver installed that's compatible with those particular devices, I can't quite get there. The pointing stick is pretty close. Between the pointing stick and the trackpad, I can usually get around 15 on those. But with Mac OS X, with any pointing device, you will be lucky if you can hit 12 on that test, 12 or 13, maybe 14. But that's a significant step down. And of course, on mobile devices, it's the Wild West. However the vendor implements it, it works or it doesn't work. But that's the subject of my mid-evening rant. If you have any thoughts, please submit those in the comments section on YouTube. Post a thread about it on XDA Developers if there's not an appropriate one there for it already, or just email xdapodcast@outlook.com. Include podcast somewhere in the subject line of your message so that your message does not automatically get thrown in the trash. Still to come, the unpopular opinion of the week, but first, Chapter 2 of Mobility Stories. Don't go anywhere.
I got that good, so I found it. People asking 'cause they want it. They keep staring, all their eyes are on me.
Where they put me in the ground, this is my town. Yeah, this is my town.
Good afternoon, happy Thursday, and welcome back to X-Bulletin. It is time for that ever-important segment, Mobility Stories. This is part 2 in what's ostensibly an 8-part series. I'm not going to tell all 8 parts in the podcast format because realistically, the final 3 chapters of that story, those being the Moto X Pure Edition, LG V20, and the Galaxy Note 10 Plus, already have dedicated review videos on the channel. So there's really not much more I can say about them, even in historical context that hasn't been said already. I might mention them a little bit in passing, either as their own episode, just piling all 3 of them together, or at the end of the Galaxy Note 2 episode. I haven't decided yet, but at any rate, today what we're going to be focusing on is the transition from the Palm M500, or more accurately the IBM WorkPad C500, the Nikon Coolpix S1, and the Onda VX878. Just to recap from the prior episode, from 2006 to 2008, that was the genesis of my mobile device fleet. Those 3 devices, again, with the technology of the day, there wasn't the level of convergence that there is in modern times, where all 3 of those devices being combined into one would be a no-brainer. Back then, they were still 3 separate classes of products, but even with that in mind, carrying around 3 separate devices in many cases simply isn't feasible. There were very few times when I would have the camera, the Palm, and the Onda with me at the exact same time. And if I did, they weren't always in my pockets and just in front of me so I could grab whatever device I needed. If there was a situation where I was just walking around and I just needed some kind of device, usually it was the camera, because in those days I just took a lot of pictures, and so that was the device that I needed. That was the gadget on the utility belt that was needed the most often. And because it was a flat pocket-sized camera, I just carried it around with me pretty much everywhere. And then usually the Palm, and much less often the Onda. So by 2008, these devices, at least the Palm, was getting pretty long in the tooth, and the desire for convergence was starting to creep up. Even though the Palm was an earth-shattering device for my middle school brain at the time, I was thinking, well, I've got these 2 pieces of equipment. They really seem redundant. They're both handhelds. They both have a touchscreen. They're both reasonably powerful. And there's a little bit of overlapping functionality, but there should be more. So when I was given the opportunity to procure an HP iPAQ 4150, or I think more accurately the 4155, I jumped on it. Now on paper, the iPAQ should have been a slam dunk over the Palm, and in a lot of ways it was. It was a much more powerful device. It basically did combine the functionality of the Palm M500 and the Onda VX878 portable media player into one. This was a device that was exponentially more powerful. It had wireless functionality for Bluetooth and wireless LAN. It still retained infrared. It still had the SD card slot, but it added a color 240 by 320 touchscreen, media functionality. This was a device this was in all 8 chapters of this story, every mobile device I've ever owned, this was the biggest quantum leap forward, with the exception of going from, basically nothing to the Palm M500. This was that single biggest, most significant transition, going from the Palm to the iPAQ. The level of performance increase was completely unprecedented. So I'll tell you a little bit about it here. It would have had some kind of 400 megahertz single core ARM processor versus, like a 30 megahertz old school Motorola processor, exponentially more memory, exponentially more storage. Even though this is a more modern device, I still consider it to be the final of the old world devices. I lump it in with the Palm, if for no other reason that it still uses volatile storage. That is what we talked about in the last episode, using memory as storage. Portable computing was outrageously expensive in those days, and truthfully, it still wasn't really all that good or all that pleasing. This was a definite step in the right direction, but storage was still so expensive that they couldn't include enough of it on the device for it to be meaningful. So once again, memory was storage on the HP iPAQ. It had a tiny, tiny sliver of user-accessible non-volatile storage, but it was such a small amount, it wasn't useful for more than maybe a couple of Word documents. Now, unlike with the Palm, where the expectation was being that you were syncing it up with the computer all the time, the iPAQ, while still very much a computer-dependent and centric device, was starting to untether itself from that workflow a little bit. Not completely, but a little bit, and enough to where they needed some kind of holdover technology. And to be clear, this was not HP's idea. This is actually a device that was built by and designed by HTC. There was not an HTC branded version of it because HTC wasn't doing that stuff at that point in time. They were just designing and building devices for other brands, well-known brands like HP. But HTC built in a backup battery into the device. Not a battery that could run the whole machine, but one that could take over in case the battery were to die, or for you to swap batteries out, because this, even though it is a device with volatile storage, had a user replaceable battery. So they had to have some kind of a mechanism where the user wouldn't be totally out in the cold if you had to swap out the battery. It's literally just a case of flipping a switch on the back cover, the battery compartment door peels right off, and then the battery is meant to be user replaceable with your thumbs. It's not built into the device requiring torque screwdrivers to get at it like with the Palm. So the first line of defense was that backup battery. Now, the backup battery was notorious for failing. In fact, by the time I got the device in 2008, it would have been about 5 years old by that point, the backup battery was long since dead, unfortunately. So what HP or HTC or whoever made this decision included as a secondary line of defense was backup software. It's actually a stripped down version of Sprite Backup rebranded as iPAQ Backup. This is actually something, even though it's a kind of trialware basic version of the application, it's still fully functional, and it basically can back up the entire device and the entire storage straight to the SD card. That includes the registry, all installed applications, all the PIM data, every single thing, basically except the time and date can be backed up. So what I was in the habit of doing, if I did carry around a spare battery with me that I needed to swap out on a weekend or something, I would just run the backup suite, swap the battery, restore the device, and everything would be back how I left it. Now, this isn't as seamless as the 30-second process of just swapping the battery if the backup were still working, but it's still a whole lot better than having to wait for a time when I can get it back to the computer and sync it up. Again, we're at this point in history, we're starting to move away. We're still not quite there yet to where we're totally untethered from the computer. We don't have cloud-based services like Google Calendar, Google Keep, online exchange calendars, Microsoft To Do, and all that kind of stuff, but we're moving in that direction. And so to that end, the iPAQ is what I would consider to be a more independent device. Even though the Palm had much longer battery life and it could be used untethered for much longer, the iPAQ, most importantly, was built for internet access and general connectivity from the ground up. It was the first mobile device I ever owned with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, which was just mind-blowing even in 2008, 5 years after this device was released. So you can imagine how novel it must have been to people who actually owned these brand new in the early to mid 2000s. But it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. The Bluetooth worked. I mean, I didn't really have a whole lot in the way of Bluetooth peripherals. I did get some Legos at one point that had Bluetooth connectivity so I could remote control it from the device, which was kind of cool, I guess. There was actually software that was published for it. There was still a very large library of software available for Windows Mobile 2003, but the software development tools of the time, unlike with the Palm OS, they only targeted the most recent couple of operating systems. So there wasn't as much reverse compatibility as it relates to that. So some applications that I was looking at, even though there was quite a lot of freeware, a lot of it was not available to me because it required as a minimum Windows Mobile 5 and Windows Mobile 6, which had already been released by that point. So a lot of times what developers would do if they were bigger publishers is they would make a Windows Mobile 5, Windows Mobile 6 version, and then they would also have a Windows Mobile 2002, Windows Mobile 2003 edition separately. But others, if they were, smaller developers, independent developers and such, then there would only be the Windows Mobile 5 and newer version, and everybody else was just out of luck. And that was the case for me for a lot of software. Not for everything. There were still some decent games, emulators especially. I remember playing a Sega Genesis emulator with Paperboy 2. I had an application that would visually overlay the state of charge of the battery as a colored bar on the very top of the screen, just a couple of rows of pixels, but it was a good visual representation to have at a glance to know how full the battery was, how recharged the battery was at that particular moment in time, since unlike with Palm OS, you actually had to drill down into the settings a little bit to be able to get to it. Speaking of the stock ROM for it, and this would actually go on to be basically the last device where I would run fully stock software without running a custom ROM, at least for quite a few years up until we got to the Moto X Pure Edition, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. If for no other reason than that there were no custom ROMs available for this device, I ran the stock software. And thankfully the stock software was actually pretty decent. There wasn't too much in the way of bloat on the stock software. There were a few things, but most of them that which were included were actually useful. For example, you had a Pocket-based version of Word, Excel, maybe even PowerPoint, at least something that could view PowerPoint presentations. Obviously, you weren't going to be editing presentations on a very small screen like that. But you got these basic Pocket versions of Microsoft Office. Of course, all of the organizer applications, tasks, contacts, and notes would synchronize seamlessly with Outlook, and it had to be Outlook if you were going first party and using the official software. But there was also an included application called, I believe it was called iTask, and it was in retrospect, a very useful task switcher application that I regret not utilizing more back in the day because it was actually pretty helpful. Windows Mobile just didn't have anything like that built in. And then going back to the wireless, I know I had mentioned it had Bluetooth. It also had Wi-Fi. Now, with that said, it was a fairly basic Wi-Fi stack. It was 802.11b only. Now, at the time, that wasn't a huge deal. B, G, and N were all forward and reverse compatible to one another. Obviously, the transfer rate would be based on the least common denominator. So in this case, it wouldn't be able to communicate any faster than wireless B, but at least it could utilize those networks. What really crippled it, though, especially toward the end of my usage cycle with it, was that it only supported open networks or WEP encryption. It might have supported WPA1, but even by the time the late 2000s rolled around, WPA2 was mainstream and widely implemented on almost every single wireless network where there was wireless security. Occasionally you would see one with WEP, but it just wasn't a technology that was used for that long. And again, this is still mid-2000s technology, so manufacturers dropped these devices like a hot potato when it came to patching. And the iPAQ 4150 was sadly no exception to that. It did get maybe a couple of stock ROM updates, but none that were meaningful. Nothing that got it past first edition of Windows Mobile 2003. There was a second edition of Windows Mobile 2003 made available, but never a stock ROM officially for the iPAQ 4150. Not that it would have mattered, because this was the first device that I had where one specific hardware element ended up being a significant bottleneck, and that was memory and storage. Now, I mentioned earlier that the iPAQ 4150 was what I consider to be my last old world portable device because it used memory as storage. Now, they did provide the user with increased flexibility, at least on this. There's actually a slider right in the stock ROM in the settings that will allow the user to change the allocation of memory to volatile storage. So if you needed more storage, you could adjust that at the expense of memory. And if you needed more multitasking, you could increase that at the expense of usable storage. Now, for me, it was always the storage that was out, so I had it maxed out in the opposite direction. But even with that being totally maxed out, I still didn't have much room to be able to install software. Even though this device had a lot more volatile and non-volatile storage than the Palm ever did, the applications were much larger in terms of how much space they took up after being installed. I was always having to pick and choose which ones I wanted to keep and which ones I didn't want to keep. So that was a factor. That was the first time I really felt the sharp pains of a specific hardware bottleneck in a mobile device. And I can tell you, I don't want to spoil the rest of the story here, but it would not be the last time. Now, the good news is it did have an SD card slot. It was not a high-capacity SDHC, so realistically, it would not be possible to use an SD card larger than 2 gigabytes in here. In fact, there's been some debate over the years over what the largest non-SDHC SD card was. Most people will tell you that it's 2 gigabytes. Some may tell you that it was 4, but by that point, most 4 gigabyte SD cards and most card readers and stuff supported the SDHC protocol. So most 4 gigabyte SD cards in circulation are in fact of the SDHC variety. So even if it did exist, would it actually work on this device? I have no idea. I never really tried one. Speaking of the SD card slot on the iPAQ, this had a special extension of the SD protocol called SDIO, which had nothing to do with storage, but actually so that the SD card slot could be used as a mounting point for peripherals and accessories. The most prominent example of this was actually a digital camera module that, believe it or not, docked into the SD card slot and gave SDIO equipped devices that could run the proper software for it basically a digital camera. And of course it wasn't a very good one, and they didn't sell a lot of these, but because of the proprietary nature of that dot connector that the device used, unlike on the Palm where it was the same dot connector used on the M500 and the M505 and the M515 and the i705, and I believe several other devices too. It was a very standard connector up until they went over to, I think, using just regular mini USB and that kind of stuff. In that ecosystem, they were able to use the dot connector as a universal docking point for all those peripherals. On Windows mobile devices, because every manufacturer was changing the connectors so frequently, and there were so many different brands, making all these different devices with different proprietary connectors, SDIO basically became the successor to having some kind of a universal dot connector in the days prior to mini USB, micro USB, and USB-C. So in addition to a camera, I think there was some kind of a GPS receiver accessory. There may have been, for devices that did not have the Wi-Fi radio equipped, a wireless LAN card. There were a lot of different choices for that. In terms of other connectivity, the HP iPAQ still had an infrared transceiver on it, but unlike on the Palm devices where the infrared window was on the top, with the expectation being that it was going to be used for either synchronization wirelessly of data with a computer or with another device, the purpose of it was for, I believe, like wireless keyboards and things of that nature, so they could be still somewhat universal. Obviously, the keyboard would sit in front of the device, so you would want to have the infrared window on the bottom of it. So that's kind of an interesting deviation where the technology was still there because it was still somewhat relevant at the time. It was just being implemented slightly differently. Again, kind of medium speed evolution here, like I mentioned earlier. In terms of other points of connectivity, the device had, full D-pad on the front, face buttons just like with the Palm. It did have a select key, which was helpful as well. And then on the side, instead of volume controls, which we're used to today because that's been part of the Android specification basically from the beginning, this had instead a button that was a shortcut to the voice recording application. Now, this was something that I never really got into personally, just doing voice recordings. I know you see this sometimes on movies and television, especially from the mid to late 2000s, where people will just record voice memos to themselves. Really, they're doing that more for plot deposition, for providing those points of detail of what they're thinking to the audience, and they just need some kind of excuse to be able to expose that. In practice, I have the feeling this just didn't get used that often, and that's coming from somebody who's right now recording his voice into a cell phone. But for non-broadcast purposes, just for taking of notes, I would think you would just use Word, or you would use the Notes app and then sync it up with Outlook or save it somewhere and edit your documents and stuff. I don't see this being useful or something that was used. Maybe it was, and maybe even you did. And if you did, leave a comment on the YouTube comments page or send an email to xdapodcast@outlook.com with podcast somewhere in the subject line of your message. To close the loop on this device, and really with the software of it, I guess I'll talk about some of the internet features, since that was one of the more novel things that this device could do, aside from video playback, which it did quite well. There were a number of different video players and audio player applications available. Again, the sky's the limit when it comes to Palm and Windows Mobile stuff. If there was an audience for it, there was software published. A lot of time it was even free or open source software, and this device would have been no exception to that. I know TC Pump was one of the most common and popular media playback applications that could do basically any audio file that you could possibly throw at it and any video file that the hardware was capable of decoding. But in terms of other special features, the web browsing ability was a big selling point of this particular device. Now, for almost the entirety of my ownership cycle of it, I actually used the stock Pocket Internet Explorer web browser application that it came with. And it actually, for the time, worked pretty well. Even though the icon was a holdover from like the old Windows 98 legacy Internet Explorer, and I'm sure it probably didn't render pages much better than Internet Explorer 6 on Windows XP and stuff did, but most sites were designed to that lowest common denominator. So for the most part, they actually rendered pretty much okay at the time. Obviously, it wouldn't be of much use today just because of how epically bloated and evolved the web has become. But I can tell you that for the time, I do remember using it and it actually being reasonably workable, surprisingly enough. Like I mentioned earlier, what really started to become this device's downfall was lack of memory, lack of storage, lack of ability to use WPA2 encryption, and the fact that sometimes it just would refuse to connect to even unencrypted open wireless networks for seemingly no reason, when other people were able to do that just fine with their fancy upper middle class iPod touch devices, which were starting to become popular in those days. Again, I own this device, or at least I daily drove it from 2008 to 2010. I actually still own it to this day, and it still works. It still runs. It still sits on my desk even. I'll even dock it and just power it on, just play around with the OS from time to time just to appreciate the evolution of technology. I think that's always good to have that level of perspective. But between peer pressure and the networking problems and the limitations of the hardware and the software of the time, those were ultimately what led me to seek switching over to a different device. And that's something that we will explore in a later episode. But the purpose of today's was just to give you a taste of what that looked like as far as this goes. I will spend just a couple of minutes to briefly mention the camera situation, because I did still carry a separate digital camera. Obviously, I never purchased the SDIO digital camera accessory for this device, not just because it wasn't very good, but also because it was fairly expensive and because I already had the Nikon Coolpix S1. Now, as you know, it had been glitched out for a couple of years. It still worked, but you had to power it up with the SD card not inserted, and then insert the SD card, and then you could use the camera, but the menus would still be glitched out. Video recording, even then, maybe kind of sort of didn't always work. So what I ended up replacing it, that being the Nikon Coolpix S1, with was the Nikon Coolpix S2, which is basically the same as the S1. It's the same basic hardware, the same sensor, probably the same chipset, same lens, same screen, same buttons. Everything's the same except the S2 is supposed to be the more weather-resistant variant of that camera. So it had a shiny lens cover that had to be manually actuated instead of automatically slid. The device was a little bit thicker. It had better waterproofing around the buttons and around the screen, and then it had a rubber membrane, which has since broken off, around the docking port on the bottom. So as a result, it has a slightly different dock than the S1, even though the port and the connector are the same. And the S1 will actually work with the S2's dock, although it fits in there a little bit loose. It does still technically function and it'll recharge it. I ended up getting the S2, I think I also used on eBay from a bicyclist, and I used that for a couple years. I never got quite the same level of use out of it as I did the S1. I had simply soured on Nikon after the S1 experience, not being able to reinstall the software or really be able to do anything to troubleshoot that problem. I felt like it should have lasted longer than it did. And I still own both those cameras to this day. Both of them are still functional. The S1, of course, in the semi-broken, zombified state that it's in, and the S2 still fully functional. I don't use them that much, but they don't have much cash value, so I've just never bothered to try and sell them. I keep the batteries recharged so that those are in good health, just in case I ever do need to use them for something. But know that by this point in history, we had whittled that down from 3 devices to at least 2. Now, in our next episode of Mobility Stories, I'm going to tell you the story of how that finally started to kind of sort of get to the point where we could get down to 1 device, that being the HTC Touch Diamond. This will be a preview of that story. I'm not going to go into any kind of significant detail on it here today, at risk of this segment going on any longer than it absolutely has to. But just know that convergence by this point was inevitable, and it was coming, and I was jonesing for a different device. And thus concludes today's X-Bulletin Mobility Stories, that being the second chapter, the iPAQ 4150 and the Nikon Coolpix S2 camera. But there's still more to come here on the show, including Unpopular Opinion of the Week. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the show, everybody, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers Forums, powered by your stories. This week, as I'm looking at the clock, perhaps a little bit overpowered because we are running up against time here. Tragically, we will not be able to air the unpopular opinion of the week, as I had hyped the whole show and fully intended to follow through on. Not to worry, I believe that is something that we can probably squeeze in the next episode. So all the more reason to subscribe on Spotify, on YouTube, and to send an email message to xdapodcast@outlook.com with the word podcast somewhere in the subject line of your message. I'm Browning8, Bill720 on the forums, signing off. Thanks so much for patronizing this show.